They laid the object on a stainless steel tray, like a relic dredged from a church floor, a waterproof camera pouch webbed in old mesh and brown with the harbor's silt. When I pinched the brittle zipper and the plastic window fogged from the change in temperature, I didn't see pictures. I saw time, 32 years of it pressed flat and sealed against the tide. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. Mornings in Devil's Elbow always start with the tide talking to wood. Pilings, groan lines, creek gulls heckle the day into motion. I've lived within 3 miles of this harbor my whole life, and the sound of a diesel engine turning over in the half-light still feels like someone drawing a curtain back on the stage. Coffee at 5:30 a.m. tastes like salt if the wind is right. By 6, lobstermen are already stepping over coils of wet rope, and by 7, the bait truck is leaking its particular perfume across Old Quarry Road. The town runs on a tide table and a calendar of chowders and funerals. If a church bell rings a second time, we all know whose porch to walk to. Before that pouch came up in the dredge, my days were unremarkable in the way you hope a detective's days are reports, witness, follow-ups. A porch talk about a fence line. My desk faces a narrow window with a sight line to the marina's crooked wind chimes. When those chimes move, I know the fog is walking in. When they stop, the day is going to burn clear and hot, 82 degrees by noon, the docks shimmering like the back of a mackerel. I sign forms with a black pen and keep a little stack of notes from my mother in the drawer grocery lists. Reminders to pick up sea salt caramels, the last one telling me to wear sunscreen even in September. She used to work part-time at the pharmacy, the kind where you could buy penny candy and a sympathy card in the same breath. People confided across that counter, and some of those words made their way to our dinner table with the care and gravity of prayer. Sundays are my day off when I'm lucky. I walk the breakwater 3/10 of a mile each way, counting the breaths it takes to reach the end. The lighthouse at the mouth of the inlet looks close enough to touch until you try to reach it by water and realize the current has a say. After the walk, I stop at the marina window for coffee, so strong Phil jokes it could unclog a bilge. He's got his uncle's way of leaning on his elbows and listening without interrupting. The old rental ledger lives under the counter, wrapped in a failing sheet of paper towel, as if that were some kind of spell against moisture. I grew up watching his Uncle Tobin shave cedar plugs with a pocket knife slivers falling like paper moons into a coffee can. Tobin knew every boat's mood. He could tell you which skiff would splutter at the third pull and which outboard would sing sweet as a hymn if you whispered to it first. Out on Old Quarry Road, a row of weather-beaten cabins faces the inlet like a line of men holding their hats during a parade. The porches sit 12 feet from the crushed shell drive, just far enough for privacy and close enough for conversation if you're the kind to wave at strangers. In July, box fans run in back bedrooms and the smell of sunscreen rides through the screens. First-time visitors measure distance in minutes, not tides, and you can spot them by how long they stand at the split in the rocks, trying to tell left from open water. The locals let them figure it out. Learning the way an inlet breathes is part of what it means to be here. I measure my day by small rituals. The courthouse clerk keeps a candy jar with the good peppermints, the kind that dissolve slow and cool. Everett, who retired from our office a decade ago, swings by once a week with the Coastal Gazette rolled under his arm and a question that isn't really a question. What are we overlooking? He has a memory, like a neat toolbox, each drawer labeled in pencil. Bring him a scrap, an address, a handwriting slant, and he'll tell you whose cousin once wrote like that, and where they went one winter when the plows couldn't crest the hill. Nicole down in forensics hums when she calibrates the old film scanner. When she hums, I know the work is precise, and the day will have answers if we ask the right questions. You get to know a place by light more than by map. At Devil's Elbow, the fog arrives like a decision, not weather. It doesn't blow in so much as settle, and when it settles, the harbor flattens into a sheet of pewter. On those mornings, the lamps along the pier burn longer than they need to. the bulbs turning halos in the damp air. Phil lets the open sign dangle unlit until he can see Gull's Point, a self-imposed rule learned the hard way in years I only half remember. The bait shack still carries the ghost of diesel on its boards, even though the pumps came out in '03. If you stand with your back to the counter, you can hear the whole harbor without looking, the soft clunk of oars dropping into their locks, the slap of a halyard against an aluminum mast, the snap of a zip tie when someone fixes a thing that should have been fixed last season. That's the rhythm I live in, people who keep their word ledger lines that add up, a town that knows the difference between minding business and turning away. Weddings are a community sport here. We bake pies in borrowed tin plates and sneak bills under the pizza box lid when nobody's looking. When a name gets taped to the grocery store corkboard, we tear off a corner of a sticky note and write down a casserole assignment like it's a binding contract. We run toward porch lights when they're left on past midnight and tell one another when we've seen a car idling too long by the boat ramp, because that's what keeps a place like this stitched together, eyes, ears, and the mutual agreement that somebody else's morning matters as much as your own. On the day the dredge crew rolled their equipment to the eastern slipway, the heat had broken. 84 by the bank clock at lunch, the kind of brightness that makes the water look like cut glass and turns the rocks into a white glare that hides barnacles until you're bleeding. The town council's expansion plan had lived on folded paper for so long, it felt like a story we told about the future. New moorings, straighter slips, a wider turning basin for the bigger boats that now and then nose in from out of state. The backhoe operator wore a bandana around his neck to keep the sun off. He waved at Phil through the glass, and Phil waved back with 2 fingers without looking up from the ledger. These are ordinary gestures that make up a place. If you blink, you miss how much love fits in a wave. Inside the sheriff's office, the air runs cold enough to raise goose flesh on sweat-damp forearms. The evidence vault door sticks because the summer humidity swells the frame. The key is brass and heavy and always a little warmer than the room even when I set it on the counter while I sign the log. I keep a list of some days tacked to my corkboard cases that need one more look, names that deserve a second set of eyes threads that might snare if I pull them again in better light. The list is written in my hand, block letters, no ornament. Above it is a photograph of the harbor from the year I turned 12, the bait shack still new painted. Tobin younger by 30 years, a skiff with its bow pointed toward the split in the rocks, and the kind of sky that makes you think July will last forever. If you want to understand me, you should know I count by textures. Rope that's been in saltwater too long slicks over like eel skin. Ledger paper from the early 90s has a stiffness that doesn't yield right away when you flip a page. You have to insist. The plastic sleeves in the courthouse archive grow brittle at the corners and crack with a sound like breaking ice if you bend them too quickly. When I said yes to this work, I said yes to touch things that pass through hands and hold traces of the people who used them. I said yes to learning which scuff on a deck is ordinary and which one tells you someone slipped where no one should have. Late in the day, the heat collapses, and you can hear the temperature drop in how the boards of the dock give up their expansion. A child's laugh will carry clear across the inlet, and dogs choose the shade with conviction. The smell of frying haddock comes off the cafe's back door around 5:30, and I can tell you the minute by how loud the ice machine dumps a fresh load into the bin. We trade small talk about the socks and whether the boat launch will finally get a new layer of concrete. Folks pass me their worries like folded napkins. Quiet. Careful nothing written that can't be spoken aloud. Most evenings I drive home the long way up the hill past the cemetery where the newer stones face the water, because families figure the dead should keep the best view. My little house sits a mile inland, clapboard pale blue, like the rental shack, a porch light with a pull chain that sticks. I'm not married. I keep 2 quilts folded at the foot of the couch and a pair of boots by the door for nights when a call means you don't have time for laces. I cook in a cast-iron skillet my mother seasoned the week she moved into assisted living, and I talk to the radio when the weather report skips our county again. The house sighs when the fog stands up off the fields. You'd think walls would forget after decades, but they remember everything that leans against them. Some afternoons you feel a change before you can name it. The air goes off-key. The gulls climb higher. The wind takes the flags by the bait shack and holds them steady instead of flicking them. A page in the ledger flutters even when the window is shut. Phil reaches for the pencil behind his ear and doesn't find it because it's already in his hand. These are nothing moments, thread-thin, the kind you could step over without seeing, and still they collect. A few weeks back, I pulled an old binder from the courthouse shelf to settle a small matter about mooring fees. The plastic sleeve crackled a sound I've heard 1,000 times, but this one felt different because of what was tucked just beyond the tab, one narrow scrap of photocopied handwriting not filed where it should have been. Not important enough at first glance to earn a signature. I smoothed it flat with my palm and read the line twice. It wasn't proof of anything. It wasn't even a sentence. It was a date, and 2 initials written in a hand that pricked a place behind my ribs I hadn't felt in years. A sensation like a draft through a closed window. I slid the scrap back into its sleeve, closed the binder, and returned it to the shelf out of habit. Then I stood with my fingers still on the spine, listening to the quiet with the intensity you give to a voice you know is about to break. Outside, the sun threw long gold planks across the marina, and the wind chimes. I can see from my office window went still for the first time all day. Phil flipped the open sign to closed and forgot to straighten it. A gull cackled once and quit. Down the hill, an engine idled longer than good manners allow and then cut. I told myself it was nothing. A draft, a scrap that had slipped, a small town's appetite for meaning in the everyday. I told myself that and locked the office, the brass key warm in my palm. On my way home, I passed the cabins on Old Quarry Road, each porch lamp timed to flick on at dusk. One light stayed on, brighter than the rest. The bulb knew its glare too clean to be comfortable. It shone across the empty drive and into the trees as if waiting for headlights that weren't coming. I drove by slowly, counting to 10 in the space between the mailbox and the turn. The lamp held steady, and I felt the town take a breath it did not release. I didn't know it then, not with the knowing that lets you call a thing by its name. I only knew the harbor had shifted a half-inch on its hinges, and somewhere beneath that clean porch light, the first hinge pin had started to lift. By the time the harbor lights dimmed that night, the fog had started crawling in again. Thick, low, the kind that muffles your footsteps and makes every sound feel closer than it really is. I sat at my desk long after everyone else had gone home, the scrap of paper from the old binder still folded in my jacket pocket. I didn't know why it bothered me so much, just that it did. A date, 2 initials, written in a hand that didn't belong to any clerk I knew. I'd seen that combination of letters before, but I couldn't place where. It was like catching a voice in a dream you can't fully remember. I kept telling myself it was nothing, a misfiled note, someone's shorthand from decades ago. But I stayed anyway, staring at the quiet hum of the evidence fridge until the hum started sounding like the ocean itself. The next morning, the backhoe operator came into the station. He looked out of place, their sunburnt face boots still muddy. He carried something wrapped in a rag, said he'd dredged it up while clearing silt near the slipway. He slid it across the counter with both hands, careful like it was alive. I peeled back the rag and saw a corroded metal case wrapped in mesh netting, heavy enough to make my wrist dip. The latch had fused shut, and the smell coming off it was sharp salt metal, something older. He didn't say much else, just that it snagged the bucket mid-scoop and nearly broke a hydraulic line. I thanked him, wrote down his name, and walked the case into evidence myself. Nicole met me in the lab later that morning. She worked slow and deliberate, the way people who've handled too many fragile things tend to do. We used a dental pick to chip away the corrosion around the latch, and when it finally gave, the sound was soft, a tired sigh, not a pop. Inside was a diver's pouch sealed with a twist clamp. Even through the grime you could see the faint yellow of old plastic and the curve of something inside. A disposable camera. I remember thinking how strange it was that a thing built for a few vacation snapshots could last longer than most marriages. It took nearly a week to get the film developed. The lab tech called me early one morning, said the negatives were intact, though the color had faded. I drove there myself, coffee still too hot to drink radio off. When I walked in, Nicole already had the prints laid out on an evidence table, each one numbered, gloved, and drying under a soft fan. The first few were ordinary tide pools, a sandwich half-eaten on a lap, sunlight scattered off the water. Daniel and Paige smiling like people who still thought the future belonged to them. Then we came to the last frame. She didn't have to say anything. I saw it the same moment she did. At first glance, it was what everyone remembered: a young couple in a rowboat, their skin lit gold by a summer evening. But behind them, half swallowed by shadow, were two more shapes. A hand resting just behind Paige's shoulder, pale and relaxed. And behind Daniel, near the stern, the faint outline of a face, not smiling, not surprised, just looking straight at whoever was holding the camera. Nicole whispered, "There are 4 people on that boat." I didn't answer. I just leaned in closer. The edges of the photo still damp beneath the plastic sleeve. I felt something shift in me, quiet, but definite, the way a lock clicks when it finds the right key. 32 years of silence had just exhaled all at once. That night I couldn't sleep. I pulled the original file from the archives, the one stamped "presumed drowned." The paper had yellowed at the edges, still held the faint smell of the old station, the mix of coffee, mildew, and paper dust that never leaves. The investigation back then had been short, almost perfunctory. A local couple, newlyweds, vanished during a short row from the harbor. The boat was found 3 days later drifting north of Gull's Point. No bodies, no foul play, noted case closed. Paige's parents flew up from Massachusetts for the memorial. Daniel's brother handled the belongings. End of file. I went over every line like I was reading scripture. Rental slip boat number 12 signed out at 5:37 p.m., July 12, 1992. The same serial number scribbled in red ink. Weather report: mild wind fog rolling in by 7. Dock hand statement: last seen heading toward the split in the rocks. Nothing unusual. Then at the very end, in Tobin Maher's handwriting, a note. Thought I saw someone else on the dock that night, maybe 2. Watched them leave. That line had been underlined, then crossed out. The follow-up section below it was blank. I rubbed a thumb over the ink until it smudged, then closed the folder. Maybe Tobin had been mistaken. Maybe the fog played tricks. But that handwriting, the same block letters from his old ledgers, it gave me an idea. I drove down to the marina the next morning. Phil Maher met me at the counter, wiping his hands on a rag that had more oil than cloth left in it. He looks like a man carved from the same timber as the dock itself, broad, slow, but sharp when it counts. When I told him why I was there, he didn't hesitate, just muttered, "You'll want the old drawer," and led me behind the counter. The filing cabinet was dented paint flaked off like dried salt. He unlocked it and pulled out a ledger wrapped in a crumbling paper towel. Uncle Tobin logged every rental by hand, he said. Didn't trust the computer. The pages smelled faintly of diesel and brine. I flipped to July 1992, tracing each name with my finger. There it was, D. Whitmer, boat number 12, signed out at 5:37 p.m. No check-in recorded, only a red circle with a question mark. Phil nodded. That meant the boat never came back. Usually it was a tow job or someone forgot to log it. He flipped to the next day. But look here, boat number 12 again, returned at 6:12 p.m. I frowned. That can't be right. Harbor Patrol didn't find the skiff until the 15th. Phil leaned over my shoulder. That's not my uncle's handwriting. See how the M loops? He printed everything. The initials beside the entry read MT, and under the notes, returned late. Needed rinse. extra jacket on board. A chill crawled through me. "You know who MT is?" He shook his head slowly. "Never seen it before." I took a photo of the page before closing the ledger, thanked him, and stepped outside. The air smelled thick like seaweed baking in the sun. The water was calm, deceptively so, and for the first time in years I felt that old childhood unease, the sense that the sea kept its own secrets, and we were just tenants. Back at the station, I pinned the photograph of the ledger next to the new evidence print. I drew a line between them. Boat 12 July 12th, 1992. 4 people, not 2. A return logged by someone who shouldn't have had the chance to. The case wasn't a drowning. It was a disappearance with intent. I called the Knox County Archives, requested copies of the old Harbor Patrol photos. Most were still on microfilm buried in some basement. It would take a few days. In the meantime, I started tracing the name behind those initials. Every old employee record, every dockhand, every maintenance log. It was like combing through a ghost town, half the names gone, others moved, some buried. But the name that finally appeared wasn't in any marina file. It was in an unrelated personnel folder from the Sheriff's Department dated 1992. Temporary hire seasonal dock laborer. Tenko Matthew. He'd worked for cash under the table, no permanent address listed. Last known residence, Finch Hollow, just north of town. When I asked dispatch to pull any follow-up information, they came back with one line: moved out of state, 1993. No forwarding contact, no taxes, nothing. I spent that evening going through the old photos of the Whitmers' boat again. Grainy shots taken when it was recovered. The inside of the skiff looked too clean, like someone had rinsed it. Only one life jacket tucked under the seat. But in the rental note, the added line still echoed in my head: extra jacket on board. I called Everett Clean the next morning, one of the old deputies who'd worked the original recovery. He lived alone in Bar Harbor now, a narrow 2-story that smelled of newsprint and old leather. He let me in without a word, gestured toward a chair. When I told him what I'd found, he stared at the floor for a long time before speaking. "You saw the photo, didn't you?" I nodded. He sighed long and slow. "I always thought there was more to it. There was a life jacket we found under the seat. Had a name stitched inside the collar, M. Tenko." I logged it. 2 days later, the note vanished from the file. He reached beside his chair and handed me an envelope. I kept copies. Thought maybe someday someone would care. Inside were faded photographs, the skiff from above, a waterlogged life jacket, and a second report with handwriting that matched his. I felt a tightness in my chest as I turned the pages. Why wasn't any of this in the case file? He smiled without humor. People around here protect their own. Back then the Whitmers were outsiders, honeymooners, pretty ones, made good photos. But Tenko, he was local, quiet. Folks looked the other way. When I left his house, the sun was already sinking. The road back to town cut between tall pines, their branches reaching over the asphalt like ribs. I pulled over halfway home and sat for a while with the engine off, the envelope open on the passenger seat. The paper rattled with every breath of wind. I thought about that photograph, the pale hand, the face in shadow, and about the red question mark Tobin had drawn beside a boat that never came back. By the time I parked in front of the station, the fog had started rolling in again, slow and deliberate, folding itself over the harbor like an old blanket. I walked inside, turned on the desk lamp, and spread everything out. The photograph, the ledger, the report, the stitched name. Each piece fit too neatly with the others, like someone had designed the gaps to make the silence believable. I sat there for a long while, the hum of the fluorescent light breaking every few seconds with a faint flicker. Somewhere outside, a buoy bell clanged once, then again softer. I took a deep breath, pulled my pen from my pocket, and crossed out the last line on the old case summary, presumed drowned. In its place, I wrote 3 words. Case reopened. Active. Outside the window, the fog pressed against the glass until even the streetlights disappeared. The only thing left was the sound of the harbor breathing and the feeling that something long buried had finally begun to stir. The fog lifted the next morning, but the air in my office still felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I'd barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photograph Paige's laugh frozen mid-breath, Daniel squinting into the sun, and behind them those shadows. It wasn't a trick of the light. I'd seen enough photographs in my life to know when a camera caught something it shouldn't have. 2 people had been in that boat. I just didn't know if they'd planned to be there, or if Daniel and Paige had ever seen them coming. I kept staring at the ledger photo on my board, the initials MT, and the old rental entry that shouldn't exist. Something about it felt deliberate, like whoever wrote it had wanted to make sure they were seen, but only by someone who knew where to look. I drove back down to the marina just after sunrise. The air was sharp with salt, and the gulls were already circling the pilings. Phil was behind the counter, half asleep, working through a crossword with a cup of black coffee. He looked up when I came in, like he already knew I hadn't let it go. "You're not done, are you?" he said, half smiling. "Not even close," I told him. He sighed and motioned toward the back. "If you're gonna dig, might as well check the storage bin. My uncle used to keep extra logbooks in a metal trunk by the bait shed. God knows what's in there now." The old storage bin was rusted through at the hinges, and the smell when I cracked it open hit like stale air trapped for decades. Salt diesel paper gone soft with moisture. I found a red binder half buried under old fishing catalogs labeled Customers, 1990 and 1993. The pages had stuck together and I had to peel them apart one by one. When I reached July of '92, the ink had bled in places, but 2 names were still legible, M. Tenko, and just below it, C. Rhodes. I froze. The handwriting was the same for both. Same slant, same pressure, as if one hand had written them both. I stared at it for a long time, the smell of rust and mold closing in. Whoever C. Rhodes was, he'd been here. Maybe not as a customer. Maybe something worse. I took photos of the pages and left the binder where I found it. The gulls followed me halfway to my car, shrieking like the place wanted to keep its secrets. Back at the station, I enlarged the handwriting on my screen, comparing it to old employment forms from the county's personnel archive. There, it was an identical R, the same odd curl at the base of each A. The name matched a former intake counselor from a juvenile detention facility 2 towns over. Clayton Rhodes. Terminated in '92, right before Daniel and Paige vanished. The note on his record was short boundary issues with minors, advised not to rehire. That kind of language always makes my stomach turn. It's how departments bury rot without having to name it. I spent the rest of the afternoon in that dim office, piecing it together like a puzzle that didn't want to be solved. Rhodes and Tenko. One local, one transient. The same summer, same harbor, and a missing couple whose boat somehow came back before it was ever found. I called Nicole in forensics and asked her to enhance the photograph from the disposable camera, the one with the shadows. When she brought me the print, she didn't say anything at first. She just laid it down, slid it across the table, and stepped back. Under higher contrast, the second face was unmistakable now, a man's jawline, the buzz of short hair eyes, focused not on the water or the couple, but directly at whoever was holding the camera. The look wasn't casual, it was study. I felt something cold move through me. "You ever get the feeling someone knew exactly what they were doing?" I asked quietly. Nicole just nodded. "All the time." I called Everett that night. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough from sleep. I told him about the names, about the handwriting, about the second face. He didn't sound surprised. "I figured that line would come back around someday," he said. "Back when the case was fresh, we got a tip about a man renting a trailer up by Finch Hollow. Quiet type. Folks called him Matty, always watching the water. I drove out once, but the place was empty by the time I got there. Just tire tracks and a pile of burnt trash. I told the sheriff we should dig deeper. He told me to drop it." Everett paused, his breath rattling in the receiver. "You find Tenko, you'll find the rest of it. But be careful. Rhodes wasn't just another drifter. He knew people. That last part stuck with me, he knew people. The kind of people who could make a file disappear or convince a town to stop asking questions." I went home, but I couldn't bring myself to turn off the light. I sat in my kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum and the slow tick of the wall clock, thinking about Paige and Daniel, about their families holding memorials without bodies, about all the years their faces sat fading in the back of a file cabinet because someone decided it was easier to call it an accident. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I drove out to Finch Hollow myself. The road was more a memory than pavement washed out in places, grass growing through the cracks. The woods on either side pressed close, dense with pine. About 2 miles up, I found what was left of a trailer pad, concrete blocks, a rusted propane tank, and a burned-out patch where something had been torched years ago. The air still smelled faintly of iron when the wind shifted. I walked the perimeter boots, crunching through dead needles until I saw it a fragment of metal half buried in the dirt. When I wiped it clean, the words stamped into it were faint but legible. Storage Finch Hollow Unit 117. My pulse picked up. The local storage manager didn't argue when I showed my badge. He pulled out an old ledger and ran a finger down the list. Unit 117 had been rented in 1996 under the name Charles Delaney. No payment since. No auction either. "We sealed it years ago," he said, unlocking the rusted gate. "Probably just junk." The padlock on the unit snapped like bone when I cut it. Inside, the air was thick and sweet with rot. My flashlight caught plastic bins stacked against the wall, a steamer trunk, and a black duffel bag slumped in the corner. I lifted the lid on the first bin. Books, manuals on carpentry, plumbing, home wiring, each one with handwritten notes in the margins. The next bin was worse. Dozens of blank VHS tapes still sealed. The third was full of clothes, women's and children's, folded with care that made my stomach twist. I didn't want to touch the rest, but I had to. The steamer trunk creaked open on hinges orange with rust. Inside were folders, names, dates, locations, all in that same small, tight handwriting. Each folder labeled subject followed by initials. I flipped one open. PW intake July 12, 1992. Compliant. Session canceled July 14th due to contamination risk. My hands shook as I turned the page. At the bottom in red pen was the notation, recording archived PR number 11. There were more folders, AM, LS, CG, and the same sick pattern ran through all of them. I wanted to stop, but I couldn't. The last bin had a red sticker that said, duplicates. Inside were hundreds of VHS tapes labeled in sequence, PR number 1, PR number 2, all the way up past 100. I stopped at PR number 11, the same number listed in Paige's file. I took it, sealed it in an evidence bag, and walked straight out of there without breathing until I hit daylight. Back at the station, I used the old viewing room, the one nobody goes into anymore. The monitor hummed as I slid the tape in. The image flickered static, washing the screen before settling on a dimly lit room. Paige sat on a pink bedspread, barefoot, her face, slack eyes half-lidded. Her tank top the same one from the photograph. Someone behind the camera murmured, "Good girl." The voice was calm, practiced, familiar. Then another man stepped into frame, tall, thin, older. I recognized him from the blurred image Nicole had enhanced. Clayton Rhodes. He said something I couldn't make out. A second man, younger, jittery, appeared beside him. Matthew Tenko. The camera zoomed in and Paige looked up, dazed. That's when I hit stop. I sat there for a long time without moving. The hum of the fluorescent light was the only sound. My throat burned, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I sealed the tape again, labeled it, and walked it to the captain's office. "This is going federal," I said, voice barely steady. "It's bigger than us." He didn't argue. By dawn the next morning, 2 unmarked SUVs were parked in our lot. Federal agents unloaded equipment evidence lockers scanners. They didn't need me to tell them what kind of case this was. They already knew. I watched as they filed the boxes one by one into a larger van, the early light flashing across the plastic evidence bags. Paige's name was written on the top one. That night I sat in my office with the window open. The fog had come back thicker than before, swallowing the harbor lights until the world felt smaller than a room. I kept hearing Everett's words, he knew people. I didn't know yet how deep it went, how long it had been running, or how many other names were in those folders. All I knew was that it had started here in a harbor that liked to forget, and that somewhere out there someone had been waiting 32 years for that silence to break. The first federal van rolled in just after sunrise, its tires crackling over the gravel lot behind the sheriff's office. By then I'd been awake for 30 hours straight. The viewing room light still burned through the window, and the smell of stale coffee clung to my clothes. I stood there with my badge clipped crooked and a pit in my stomach the size of Maine itself, watching as strangers in dark jackets carried boxes past me, boxes that held pieces of a nightmare none of us were ready to measure. I wasn't leading anymore. I was just the one who'd opened the door. They moved quickly. Scanners humming, labels hissing from portable printers' gloves, snapping in the cold morning air. The lead agent introduced herself as Kravitz. No small talk, no pretense. She looked like someone who'd been doing this too long to flinch. "You'll want to brief us in sequence," she said, eyes flat but not unkind. I laid out everything: the photograph, the ledger, the trailer site, the storage unit, the tape labeled PR-11. When I finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said, "We've seen versions of this before." She didn't say where or when, and I didn't ask. By mid-morning, the evidence room was lined wall to wall with those plastic bins from Finch Hollow. Some were still damp with mildew. The labels glared under the fluorescent light like fresh bruises, hundreds of them numbered in sequence. I stood back trying to take it in. It wasn't just the Whitmers. It couldn't be. Each folder had initials that didn't belong to any missing persons file in our county, maybe not even in our state. The agents worked in pairs, cataloging and photographing. Every so often, one of them would stop, swallow hard, and quietly call for a supervisor. You didn't have to ask what they'd found. The silence told you. While they processed the tapes, I focused on what I could control: the paper trail. I started cross-referencing those initials with archived reports, missing persons, runaway notices, old hospital logs. I found 2 matches within the hour. Both cases had been written off as voluntary disappearances in the early 90s. Both had last been seen within 50 miles of Devil's Elbow. I felt my throat tighten. This wasn't random. It was a circuit, and our harbor was one of its stops. That night, I went back to the storage unit with Kravitz and her tech team. The air outside had gone sharp with early autumn. The pine trees creaked in the wind, and the metal siding of the unit rattled like it wanted to speak. Inside, the temperature dropped 10 degrees, the kind of chill that sinks into bone. The agent swept every inch with black lights and portable scanners tracing prints that had survived the years. When one of them lifted a fingerprint from the edge of the trunk, Kravitz leaned closer. "We'll run it against Rhodes," she said quietly. I nodded, but didn't answer. I'd seen enough of that handwriting to know it was his work long before the print confirmed it. Back at the station, Nicole handed me the digital transfer from PR-11. She didn't say anything when she passed it over, just met my eyes. For half a second, her face pale. I waited until everyone had gone for the night, then locked myself in the viewing room. The glow of the monitor felt almost blue in the dark. The image opened on that same small room. Paige sat where she had before. Her head tilted, her eyes heavy. But what the camera captured this time wasn't motion. It was ritual. Someone behind the lens was giving directions. His tone calm, rehearsed. Another voice answered, jittery, younger. I recognized it from the old personnel files. Tenko. The older one stepped forward into the frame, his face now clear under the light roads. He reached out toward Paige, not violently, not tenderly either, but like he was adjusting an object on a shelf. When I stopped the playback, the sound of my own pulse filled the room. I carried the tape straight to Kravitz. She didn't need an explanation. She took it from my hands and said, "You shouldn't have to watch these." I told her I already had. She nodded once, like she'd expected that answer. "Then you know what we're dealing with," she said. By dawn, the team had traced multiple storage rentals under aliases linked to Rhodes and Tenco. Most had been cleared out years ago, but one location kept repeating in the notes from the Finch Hollow folders, Half-Bridge Lake. The files mentioned it casually, like shorthand maintenance requests, a generator receipt, a plumbing invoice signed with Tenco's name. When I showed Kravitz, she didn't hesitate. "We'll check it first." Half-Bridge sat 40 minutes inland, a pocket of still water ringed by pine. The road in was barely a road at all, just dirt packed hard by weather and neglect. By the time we reached the clearing, the afternoon light was going gold, that eerie hour when the world feels too quiet. The cabin stood 100 yards from the lake gray and listing windows clouded from the inside. Moss crept up the steps and the porch sagged under its own weight. The air smelled of rot and cold metal. Inside, the silence felt almost physical. The first room was empty but for a folding chair and a milk crate. A dead wire ran along the wall, stapled neatly into the wood leading to a corner where a small security camera hung lifeless. In the next room, the air changed. The smell thickened old fabric damp wood, something faintly sweet. There was a mattress on the floor, covered by a pink blanket so faded it looked gray. A child's nightlight shaped like a rabbit sat on the windowsill unplugged. I crouched beside the bed, staring at the wall. Under the wallpaper you could see the marks, tiny deliberate tally lines etched into the wood, hundreds of them. I didn't have to count to understand what they meant. Kravitz's team moved through the house, cataloging everything. One of them found a small box sealed with duct tape on a closet shelf. Inside were photographs. Polaroids, mostly children's faces, some too blurred to recognize, others heartbreakingly clear. A girl with dark hair holding a chalkboard with the date August 14th, 1992. My hands went cold. That was the day the Whitmers' boat had been found drifting. Paige hadn't died that night. She'd been here. I walked outside to breathe. The wind off the lake carried a sound, soft, rhythmic, the faint slap of water against wood. I followed it down through the trees until I reached the shoreline. The reflection of the cabin shimmered across the surface, warped by ripples. I knelt, dipped my fingers in the water, and felt how cold it was even in late summer. It struck me then that Daniel might have made it this far too, that maybe he'd seen this same shoreline before everything went dark. When the agents came out, they carried something wrapped in tissue, thin metallic. A ring. It was dented, but the engraving inside was still legible. To P forever. D. I took it carefully. It was light, but it felt like it weighed 100 pounds. "We'll send it to the lab," Kravitz said. I just nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak. Back at the station, Nicole ran DNA tests on the ring. The blood trace in the channel was too degraded to match, but it was human male. It could have been Daniel's. She didn't say it, but we both knew. I played the PR-11 tape one more time that night. Not to watch, just to listen. Rhodes' voice was steady, clinical. Tenko's trembled now and then, nervous, unsure. They weren't just monsters. They were men who had convinced themselves that what they were doing had structure purpose. That was what chilled me most. The calm, the order of it. By midnight, I'd pulled every record I could find on Rhodes. His trail was a pattern of new jobs and quiet exits, 2 years here, 1 year there, always, with access to people who couldn't fight back. Camps, hospitals, youth programs. Each termination report said the same thing in different words. Boundary concerns. And always, he left before anyone asked too many questions. It made me sick to think how many towns might have stories they'd never connect. At 3 in the morning, Kravitz called from her hotel. She'd been going through the newer tapes ones labeled in higher sequence numbers. PR-24, PR-36. 2 of them mentioned Half-Bridge Lake by name. The background noise matched the same room we'd found down to the creak of the floorboard by the door. One of the recordings even had a man's voice in the background whispering something about the princess room. The same phrase scrawled on the storage trunk. It wasn't just a nickname. It was part of their ritual. We met again at dawn to plan the follow-up search. I remember the way the morning looked through the station window, fog lifting off the inlet sun, bleeding through it like milk through water. I didn't feel relief, not even when the federal vans rolled out toward the lake again. What I felt was dread, because every time I thought we'd reached the bottom of this thing, it deepened. Every new piece of evidence just widened the circle of what might still be out there. Later that day, while the agents coordinated search warrants for other properties, I sat at my desk and listened to the harbor. The wind was shifting in from the east, bringing the sound of the buoy bells, faint and hollow through the glass. I thought about Daniel's ring, about the last look on Paige's face in that photo from the disposable camera, the way she seemed to be caught mid-laugh, unaware of the hands just behind her. I thought about how many families never even got that last image, just a gap in the calendar where someone used to exist. Around 9 that night, Kravitz called again. Her voice was steady but low. "We're pulling everything tied to roads into a federal database. It looks like this operation had layers. Safe houses, aliases, maybe others still active. We'll find them." I believed her. But belief didn't ease the ache. When I hung up, I turned off the lights in my office and sat in the dark. The window glass was cool under my palm. Somewhere out there beneath the same night sky was the truth about what happened to Daniel and Paige, the real truth, not the version written in old reports. I didn't know then that one more piece of it was already waiting hidden just a few miles away at the bottom of the harbor, sealed tight against time. I only knew the case wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And that the water once again would be the one to give it back. The water was restless again the morning they went down. The harbor was quiet, the air sharp enough to sting, and the dive team's ropes trailed across the dock like veins. I remember standing there watching their helmets vanish one by one beneath the gray and thinking about how many times that same stretch of water had taken something without giving it back. But this time, it did. 32 years after Daniel and Paige vanished, the sea finally surrendered what it had kept. The divers surfaced one after another, their voices flat through the radios. "We've got it," one said. "We've got both." They found the second boat wedged deep in the silt under the eastern channel, an old aluminum skiff stripped bare of paint ribs, cracked hull half crushed from years of tide pressure. Inside, 2 skeletons sat side by side, knees folded, backs pressed against the same plank. The divers said it looked like they'd been arranged that way. They were still wearing what was left of their clothes, the fabric long dissolved into threads. There were no ropes, no bindings, no signs of a struggle, just a quiet arrangement like whoever left them there had meant for them to stay together. When they lifted the remains out, a small leather wallet fell free from the debris still sealed shut from the cold. Inside was Daniel's driver's license, the photo so faded you could barely see his smile. I think that was the moment when all of us, me, Kravitz, even the divers, stopped pretending this was just a case file. Forensics later confirmed what the bones already told us. Daniel and Paige had died within days of the disappearance. Both had injuries consistent with blunt trauma, most likely from a heavy object. The same kind of mark the forensic lab found on another body from a linked case across the country. It tied back to Rhodes and Tenco without question. The pattern, the timing, the trophies, it all fit. When the lab matched Rhodes' fingerprints to the prints on the skiff and the items in the cabin, the case became airtight. He'd kept them alive just long enough to film what he wanted, and when they'd served their purpose, He'd ended it. Then he'd hidden the truth under the same water he'd always watched from his porch, trusting that the tide would do the rest. Tenko was easier to find than I expected. He'd been living under a false name in a small apartment in New Hampshire, working odd jobs and paying cash. When the agents moved in, he didn't fight. They said he looked like he'd already been waiting. During questioning, he spoke softly sometimes, losing his words halfway through. He admitted to helping Rhodes, luring the couple, cleaning the boats, logging false returns, but claimed he'd been forced. He called Rhodes the overseer, said he was the one who made the rules, the one who decided who stayed and who didn't. When they showed Tenko the photos of the cabin, he broke. It wasn't remorse exactly. It was something emptier, like a man realizing too late that he'd built his life around someone else's nightmare. 2 weeks later, Rhodes was found in Montana in a public library of all places. A local librarian recognized him from an old bulletin photo we'd circulated, same jawline, same eyes, though older. Now the face hollowed by time. He didn't resist the arrest either. When Kravitz told me they had him, I thought I'd feel relief. But when they walked him past the cameras, his expression wasn't defiant or afraid. It was blank, like he'd already erased himself from the story. During his confession, he spoke in that same calm tone from the tapes describing each event like a man reciting inventory. He said he never killed for pleasure, that he preserved moments. That phrase stayed with me. Preserved moments. I suppose in his mind that made it art or maybe control. In the end, it made him a monster hiding behind a vocabulary that made him feel civilized. He pleaded guilty to all counts, 5 murders in total, Daniel and Paige among them, and 3 others the evidence could tie to him. Life without parole. The courtroom was silent when the verdict came down. No one cheered. No one cried. Just a long exhale that felt like it had been building since 1992. I sat in the back row with Everett, who'd come down from Bar Harbor for the hearing. He didn't say a word until the gavel struck. Then he leaned over and whispered. Took the tide a while, but it came back in. Afterward, I went down to the docks. The marina looked almost the same as it had that first summer. The same boards, the same creak in the rope when the wind shifted. Phil was closing up for the night. He poured me a cup of coffee that tasted like salt and said, "So it's done." I nodded. But the truth was, I didn't know. Cases like that don't really end. They just quiet down enough for you to hear the rest of your life again. A few months later, we held a small service by the water. Paige's parents were gone by then, but her niece came. She stood beside the railing with her hands folded, a scarf pulled tight around her neck. The wind picked up halfway through, scattering flower petals across the harbor like pale confetti. When it was over, she stayed behind, watching the tide roll out. She said she'd spent most of her life not knowing what happened, just knowing that someone somewhere had to. "Now I can stop imagining," she said softly. "That's enough. I think that's the closest thing to peace any of us ever get in this line of work." Kravitz and her team kept working the broader network for months after Rhodes' conviction. They uncovered other sites, some active, some abandoned, but most of what they found was fragments, tapes without sound rooms, long emptied small traces of the people who'd vanished. The operation had spread farther than we ever imagined, a web held together by fear and silence. But the arrests that followed brought a kind of justice to faces that had been missing from the record for decades. That's what matters most. Not closure, but clarity. The truth finally taking shape after all those years underwater. I stayed in Devil's Elbow. Some nights I still hear the buoys in my sleep. The harbor never really stops talking. It changes pitch with the seasons, louder in winter, almost kind in summer. But it always carries that same undertone, the one that reminds you how thin the line is between what's seen and what isn't. Phil kept the old ledger behind the counter. We added one final entry at the bottom of the page where Tobin had written Daniel's name. July 12th, 1992. Returned. No initials, no notes. Just that word. Returned. Every so often, tourists come through asking about the story. They've heard bits and pieces, usually half-true versions retold at the diner or from some old article online. I don't correct them. Some truths belong to the people who lived them, not the ones who read about them. But when they ask what kind of place Devil's Elbow is, I tell them it's like any other harbor town. Good people, quiet lives, and a memory that runs deeper than it looks. I don't mention the divers or the boxes or the sound of that first camera latch breaking open. Those parts are mine to keep. As for Paige and Daniel, they were buried together in a small cemetery overlooking the inlet. The headstone is simple. 2 names, 1 date, and the words, "Safe at last." Sometimes, when the fog settles thick over the water, it feels like they're still there, watching the tide breathe in and out. Maybe that's just how the living cope with stories that keep the dead close enough to touch. It's been months since the trial ended, and still I find myself reaching for that case file like it's unfinished. The pages are worn soft now, the ink blurred from my hands. I think about the ring found in the cabin, about the way it gleamed when the light hit it, and how love can survive even in the ugliest corners of the world. I think about how long the sea can keep a secret, and how no matter how deep it sinks, something in us keeps listening for the sound of it rising. I don't go out on the water much anymore, but sometimes I walk the dock at night when the wind's down and the moon hits the surface just right. There's a peace in that moment that's hard to explain, a mix of sorrow and gratitude, like standing between what's gone and what's still here. I guess that's what this job really is in the end, listening to what the past still has to say and hoping it speaks clearly enough for someone else to hear. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for headlines, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because some stories like the tide deserve to keep returning.